Group. Yep.
Okay. At U.S. Indo-PACOM, he's a professional intelligence officer, been at it for a long time. I won't say how long, Loren. But Loren, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the rest of the panel, and we'll get started.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. So aloha, good afternoon, everybody. As Larry said, my name is Loren Johnson. I'll fill in the blank. I've been a career intelligence officer now for 39 years, both as an active duty Army officer and for the last 18 years as a civilian. And of that 29 years, or 39 years, I've spent the last 24 of them in Hawaii and 22 of them at Indo-PACOM. And I bring that up only because I think it gives me a bit of a unique perspective on the threats in our theater, what's changed, and the perspective of having watched it firsthand. Now, I know some of you are a little bit confused because you looked at the agenda or you saw the thing online and it said the moderator is going to be Brigadier General Catherine Braun, and I'm clearly not her. General Braun is our J2 mobilization assistant. She's a career reservist, and she's here in Hawaii to help backfill leadership in the J2. Unfortunately, you've heard the old adage of the plan never survives contact with the enemy. Unfortunately, our plan didn't survive contact with ourselves because the J2's out of town, the deputy J2 is ill today, and the commander scheduled several events this afternoon that required her personal attendance at them. So when you see me, you can envision a much more professional Army general officer, but unfortunately you got me. So I'm joined here to my left by Mr. Ben Needles, who's our Chief Technology Officer in the Indo-PACOM J2 Enterprise, and Commander William Fox, Will, is one of the foremost China experts in the United States Navy, and arguably in the United States military. And I've known Will a little bit for a number of years now, and he brings a really fascinating, unique perspective on our pacing threat as it exists today. So we've got a few prepared remarks, and we're going to spend a few minutes up here going through some things that we think are important to share for this audience, and then we'll spend time answering questions. And I believe you've got a process in place to submit questions, and we'll do our very best to respond to them. As I just mentioned to a friend here before we started, my personal motto is I have the right to remain silent, just not the ability. So we'll do our best to try to answer whatever you have within the limits of our authorities as intelligence officers and within classification restrictions of being in an unclassified venue. So if I may, I'm going to just kind of run through a few things that General Braun had intended to say. Then Will's going to follow and talk a little bit more about some of the tactical developments and gray zone activities in theater. It's going to come back to me in my actual speaking role that we had planned today, and I'm going to talk a little bit about changing relationships in the theater. Now, none of these are really technical up to this point. That's where Ben comes in, because he's hitting cleanup here, and he's going to kind of bring it all into the more practical sorts of things that many of you are interested in. So with that, let's jump off. And like I said, I have prepared remarks. So good afternoon. My name is Brigadier General Catherine Braun. No, that's not right. Okay. So I suspect some of you or many of you were probably here for the panel last year. I was a member of that panel. Ben was a member. But the panel chair was at the time Rear Admiral Tom Hendershett, who was the Director of Intelligence last year. And Admiral Hendershett talked about the challenges in the theater, what was happening with pressure campaign, what was happening in terms of military modernization and development, and some of those sorts of things. What I want to kind of do today is bring you up to date on what's happened in the last year. And so that you walk away from this panel with a better understanding of the development, some of the challenges, how they are interconnected with each other, and to be able to put it into the lens of your life. What is it you do? I have no idea what you all do. So I can't sit up here and tell you something that's going to be particularly relevant necessarily to your business, your initiatives, and your expertise. But I hope you'll see yourself in these comments someplace and look for opportunities to help us advance our advantages and continue to uphold a free and open Indo-Pacific. So let me run through a kind of an incomplete but somewhat dramatic list of the things that have happened in the last year. North Korea renounced its longstanding goal of Korean reunification and has encapsulated in their constitution an independent and separate North Korea with no longer a goal of a unified peninsula. Over the last week or so, they've been destroying roads and inter-Korean symbols of unification as a physical manifestation of that change in policy. Since late last year, they've been enabling Russia to continue its war in Ukraine by transferring large quantities of conventional arms and ammunition, including rocket and artillery munitions and ballistic missiles for the Russians to employ against Ukraine. And I think the publicly available figure now is the Russians have launched up to 100 North Korean origin ballistic missiles. And if you've watched the news or read the news in the last couple of days, you now know the latest twist in this story is the deployment of actual North Korean combat forces into Russia to fight side by side with Russia in the fight against Ukraine. And part of what's enabling that is the Mutual Defense Treaty Light that has been signed between the two countries, where they are offering mutual military assistance in the event either's territory is invaded. So now with Ukrainian operations penetrating the border of Russia proper, that's now justification for Russia to call their best buddies in Pyongyang and ask for help. So that one's going to be really interesting to watch play out. On the peninsula itself, or more specifically off the east coast, in the last year, North Korea's launched about 50 ballistic and cruise missiles, mostly for research and development and to continue building that capability for strategic strike. The comprehensive military agreement was dismantled, and my favorite one from the peninsula, they've launched thousands of waste balloons across the border. And in case anybody hasn't paid attention, they're called waste balloons because in many cases they're filled literally with human waste. And it's a lot kinder term than the one I would prefer to actually use. Okay, so that's North Korea. Russia has continued to field advanced capabilities into the Pacific despite all the pressures from the war in Ukraine. Specifically, naval capabilities. I think we'll talk to at least some of those when he gets into that. But the additive capability for the Russians is dramatically expanding their long-range conventional and nuclear strike capabilities against the U.S. homeland and against our allies and partners. I mentioned the Ukraine campaign a couple of times. What it hasn't done is fundamentally changed Russia's presence and operations in the Pacific. They're still flying simulated nuclear strike patrols with bombers off Alaska and Canada periodically. They're sailing ships and submarines as part of large-scale exercises demonstrating not only homeland defense, but also power projection capabilities within that. And we think a lot of it is really an effort to show the world that Russia isn't totally consumed by what's going on in Ukraine. Yes, they've taken losses, but they still have substantial other capabilities to bring to bear. Okay, so that's North Korea and that's Russia. Obviously, the one that's left is the People's Republic of China, or more specifically, the Chinese Communist Party and its armed wing, the People's Liberation Army. And I set it up that way intentionally because it's important to understand that the PLA exists to support the party. It's not an instrument of the state. Officers don't swear allegiance to any sort of constitution or governing document. They swear allegiance to the party and to the party's paramount leader, who currently is and has been for a while, Xi Jinping. We talk about military buildup and the fielding of advanced systems of the PLA. The only point I'll make here is we've not seen any dramatic drop-off either because of COVID or because of China's ongoing economic challenges. So the trend line still is going in an upward trajectory. They're still pressuring U.S. and allied reconnaissance aircraft in the theater with close and sometimes dangerous maneuvers. The pressure campaign against Taiwan has escalated fairly significantly. Most recently, just a week and a half ago, they executed what they call Exercise Joint Sword 2024B. They'll call it an exercise. I'll call it what it is. It's a coercive demonstration intended to intimidate, threaten, and cow Taiwan into submission, and partly a rehearsal for potential future combat operations. Okay. On another note, a couple of weeks ago, they launched a nuclear-capable ICBM into the South Pacific, impacting just north of French Polynesia. First open ocean launch for a Chinese ICBM since 1980. I was in high school in 1980. I don't remember that one, but I remember this one. South China Sea, dangerous and aggressive actions against the Philippines, ramming, water cannoning, boarding, axes, the poor Filipino sailor that lost a finger in an incident, all attempting to reinforce a narrative of Chinese sovereignty and control in an area that the International Tribunal in The Hague in 2016 said is an unsubstantiated claim. Yet They keep reiterating the claim and becoming more and more aggressive. But not just against the Philippines, against Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, others as appropriate. They're pressing along the Indian border. Positive news this week where they reached a basic agreement to pull back to 2020 positions along the border, but no effort to actually resolve the long-term issues. So that one's going to continue to bubble. And then the China Coast Guard and so on and so on. Okay, so let me close this out. What's it all mean? I would summarize it this way. It means our potential adversaries are each getting more capable, more active, and the risk of an incident or crisis is increasing, individually and cumulatively. With more forces more active in more places more often, we also have a really hard time distinguishing what's normal and what is preparations for a potential military action. For us intel guys and gals, we talk about in terms of warning, strategic warning, operational warning, tactical warning, and our ability to warn is being eroded, and our ability to warn decisively with less ambiguity is dropping dramatically. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the U word. And everybody goes, what? The U word? Urgency. 5 years ago, Xi Jinping told the PLA to build 3 capabilities by 2027. We always focus on one, but there's actually 3. Compel Taiwan unification by force, if necessary, successfully counter a U.S.-led intervention, and ensure domestic threats to internal stability are controlled. Okay? It was not a directive to do those things in 27. It's a directive to be prepared to do them. There's an important distinction. Okay, we're sitting in 2024. 2027 kind of seems like a long way away. I looked at the calendar and got out a calculator. It's 799 days from now, 2027 begins. 799 days ago was August 15th, 2022. Does that seem like a long time ago? Doesn't to me. We're 6 months into the war in Ukraine at that point in time. Okay, so when we stress this need for urgency, for speed, for near-term delivery of capabilities, that's really what we're talking about. Okay, so obviously there's a ton more that I could say. I'm going to stop at that point. I'm going to lateral over to Will to continue, and then you'll hear from me in a couple of minutes.
All right, you guys hear me okay? All right, hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Commander William Fox. I'm the Director of PAC Fleet's Maritime Intelligence Operations Center, or the MIOC, responsible for operational intelligence in Indo-PACOM AOR. I'm a naval intelligence officer. I've been focused on China in various diplomatic, analytic, and operational capacities for most of my career. I've been asked to talk about significant submarine and surface naval developments, as well as China's gray zone coercive activities. So, starting with submarines. Russia's Pacific submarine fleet is improving. Last month, Russia conducted an interfleet transit of a Severodvinsk 2 SSGN, doubling the number of Severodvinsks in the Pacific, albeit from a low baseline of 1 to 2, and that first one only arrived in 2022. These are caliber capable, meaning that they shoot both ASCOMs, anti-ship cruise missiles, and land attack cruise missiles. Second, China is expanding its nuclear submarine fleet at a pace that is not widely appreciated. The PLA Navy launched 2 Shang-3 SSGNs in the 9 months between May 22 and January of 23, and could have 3 operational hulls by 2025, according to the Congressional Research Service. Naval War College projects that China may construct up to 8 of these Shang-3s, likely equipped with vertical launch system tubes able to launch anti-ship and land attack cruise missiles. This is on top of the Zhou SSN that launched in Wuhan. This is the one that sank at the pier promptly and prompted a lot of sort of amused discussion in the press. But failures aside, this means that China has built at least 4 nuclear-powered submarines in roughly 2 years. It's faster than they normally do it. Operationally, these expanding fleets, and especially the SSGNs, will increase and diversify the threats to U.S. forces and even to U.S. territory, including a covert strike capability. Or I'll put it another way. The number of adversary submarine LACM shooters in Indo-PACOM has gone from 0 2 years ago to 5 today. So it's a big change. Moving on to the surface force, China's expanding fleet is well documented, so I'm not going to belabor the point other than to do a little bit of basic math of multi-mission VLS cells per ship multiplied by order of battle over time. So a decade ago, China had a total of 3 Luoyang 3 DDGs, total of 192 VLS cells. Today they've got 25, each with 64 VLS cells, that is 1,600 tubes. They've got 8 Renhai cruisers. Each of them has 112 VLS cells. That's 896 tubes. So a little bit of public math, that's roughly 2,500 multi-mission VLS cells, a 13-fold increase in just under a decade. And these numbers don't include the air defense VLS on frigates or the SSGNs that I just mentioned a moment ago. And the 2022 annual report to Congress projects that these surface ships will be equipped with LACOMs as well. So I'm not trying to be the intel guy that just admires the threat. Like we have VLS advantage, we have submarine advantage. However, I'm mentioning these trends because they will have resource allocation and risk assessment implications for both Indo-PACOM and PAC Fleet. So moving from China's high-end order of battle to the low end of the spectrum where gray zone coercion is a daily reality. At a tactical level, as Loren alluded to, we've seen a consistent PRC playbook over the last year. China continues to use a layered mix of militia, law enforcement, and Navy with a heavy reliance on the China Coast Guard for the actual forward edge of the enforcement. They can do that because they've got a bench of 140 large ocean-going CCG ships. China tries to control and choreograph access to disputed territories with a Swiss Army knife of tactical options. So they try to maintain an overwhelming correlation of forces. You see photos of these confrontations. There's often a 4-to-1 force ratio with China's advantage. They maneuver to block adversary ships' routes. They bump or shoulder to physically push the ships out of the areas, or they use water cannons to disable or to damage smaller ships. And once that ship has stopped, then they surround it completely and can either physically move it or persuade it to leave. Now, if ships get through the cordon, the PRC, I can't think of a better word than punishes them. Most of the most flagrant examples you might remember were during the Second Thomas Shoal resupply in June and attempts to evict the Philippine Coast Guard from Sabina Shoal earlier this year. Saw instances of China Coast Guard personnel using knives and axes to destroy Philippines maritime law enforcement equipment and puncture ribs. As Loren mentioned, they physically boarded Philippines Coast Guard ships, and then actively rammed, like intentionally putting holes in Philippine Coast Guard's patrollers to disable them. And interestingly, in the information domain, China is rapidly disseminating polished but inaccurate Chinese versions of events within minutes or hours of these events as they take place, which tells me that some of these things that look like they're crises are actually pre-planned, deliberate confrontations, not crises that got out of control. China's gray zone coercion can seem chaotic and unpredictable, right? The footage is shaky, everybody's yelling, there's sirens, it looks like it's the Blair Witch Project, but if we look at China's stated intentions, we can see that the chaos is often planned and centrally directed. Doctrinal descriptions of what is called confrontational non-war military activities, or NUMA, match what we see in practice. So these operations explicitly include and allow low-intensity violence and coercion. Doctrinal writings characterize NUMA as politically driven. Quote, they are launched to achieve certain political goals. They are centrally directed and controlled. So coercive NUMA required, quote, unified command and needs the CMC, the Central Military Commission, authorization to make decisions, issue orders about the operations, integrating military, law enforcement, and militia forces into centralized C2. These quotes are from the Science of Military Strategy, a Chinese doctrinal work that is used to educate their senior colonels. This also governs the rules of engagement. So central policy sets the bounds of acceptable coercive behavior, placing restrictions on, quote, their scale, forms, and means. And this is the one that it gets me the most. They use rival actions as excuses to achieve predetermined objectives. They have pre-planned reactions. So never let a good crisis go to waste. Wait for the Philippines to do something that ticks you off. And then reactions, this is a quote from Science and Military Strategy again, reactions are made on the basis of emergency response plans that were made in peacetime and should be put into effect in order to realize predetermined objectives. So there's some nuances here. Doctrine doesn't always govern practice, as anybody in U.S. service will tell you, right? So it says how they say they want to do it, and we can't use aspirational statements to draw a straight line and attribute malice of forethought to everything that happens in the South China Sea. You know, the Vietnamese fishermen that got beat up a couple weeks ago, I can't say that Xi Jinping directed that. However, when we see repeated actions and patterns, they do provide a useful framework for interpreting trends. Second, China doesn't apply these principles in the same way against all of its rivals all the time. Instead, it tends to focus coercive activity on a single rival at a time and to divide and conquer as opposed to unifying opposition. So it's currently the Philippines. So this means that they have a limited utility for prediction, but are still useful for interpreting intent. In closing, so if we look at China's gray zone course of activities through the interpreted lens of China's stated intention, we can see that while the flavor of the month changes, there's actually remarkable continuity over the course of more than a decade. However, the underlying trend this year is that the PRC has become more risk acceptant in the tactics it uses. Water cannons and ramming are sort of boring now. They've become routine. That's expected. But this is profoundly dangerous. China is rolling the dice every time it runs these operations. And if they continue to use these TTPs, they will kill somebody or sink a ship. And I don't know that China has fully thought through the implications of what happens at that next step, especially if the ship that they sink is a U.S. treaty ally. That's all I've got.
I thought I was depressing. Good heavens. Okay, so it's back to me for actually my planned portion. And I'm going to talk a little bit. So we've talked mostly the military developments. I want to stray into the geopolitical world just briefly and talk a little bit about the changing relationships, because those are an important part of the strategic environment as well. I'm going to start with the so-called no-limits partnership between the PRC and Russia. Well, that agreement is now coming up on 3 years old in next February. And one thing that's abundantly clear is there are clear limits in the relationship. So maybe it's a bad translation from Chinese or Russian into English, but I think what they meant to say was a partnership of convenience with very clear and unpliable limits in place, or something like that. With the war still ongoing in Ukraine, you would think a no-limits partner would be the one providing arms and ammunition and personnel to the fight. But it's not. China's not doing that. North Korea is. Very different kind of relationship there. Beijing does provide rhetorical support. They're providing political support. They're providing some economic outlets. And they're likely providing some support into Russia's defense manufacturing sector in order to facilitate arms manufacturing. But they're not actually sending stuff to the fight. Overall, the relationship continues to deepen in places, mostly because both sides see value in that relationship, but it truly falls short of a no-limits partnership, especially when you compare it to partnerships we have with our actual allies. Now, the one piece that we spend a lot of time in the headquarters looking at is the military dimension. The series of bilateral naval and air force engagements that occur. And just in the last couple of months, we've had the latest bilateral naval patrol up in the Arctic. We had a Coast Guard bilateral patrol in the Arctic, and we've had air activity up in that same area. So it is happening, but we would say that the overwhelming purpose of these remains messaging, showing how they are aligned, showing how they're working together. They're not really working to become interoperable. They're showing us something that they want us to see. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is Russia and the DPRK, and I've already talked a little bit about that during my General Braun remarks a little bit earlier, so I won't dwell on it very long. But the one piece I haven't really addressed yet is, what is North Korea getting out of this? So yes, they're sending a bunch of stuff to Russia. What are they getting in return? Well, the publicized piece of it was they were going to get some modest food and economic assistance, but most specifically, they'd be getting help with their space program, which then by default means they're getting help with their long-range missile program, because the technologies associated with both have a whole bunch of commonalities with them. So whenever it happens, the next North Korean space launch may be significantly different from the last one, because we've now had enough time for that kind of aid and assistance to potentially manifest within it. So North Korea's had some challenges putting stuff into space. They're hoping to get better as a result of that. The last of the relationships, obviously, is the one left, China, North Korea. And that's the one that's probably had the least dramatic change within it, but one in which we have some specific concerns, honestly. The growing North Korea-Russia relationship is likely making Beijing a little bit nervous, because they don't really want a more capable, more aggressive, more unpredictable Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang with increased capabilities and perhaps increased confidence in order to act. So obviously there's some concern there with that. Okay, all of these relationships are at some level marriages of convenience. There are important advantages that both sides receive from them, but they're not the deep binding relationships that I think we have with ours within that. So that's a little bit of the geopolitical environment. And then batting cleanup here, number 7.
Hey, you set me up for success. So what does this all mean, right? So you've heard, we've talked a lot about data, how we see the environment, how we're pulling in massive amounts of information, how we're processing that to try and get to a decision advantage. The challenge that we run into is we have lots of different ways to collect information, and all of those were developed as a special capability, which means that they were special when they were put together. And we've got special ways for how we analyze and process that information. And then we have special ways in which we take that information and then execute it in some type of mission, whether it's through a decision brief, or it's into a weapon system, or it's into a warning capability. So one of the big things that I focus on is integration management, right? How are we taking all of these disparate capabilities from how we see the environment to how we understand the environment to how we affect the environment and integrate those capabilities together? One of the analogies that I like to use that I think becomes really helpful for you as you think about how INDOPACOM in particular, but I think the larger defense intelligence enterprise and hopefully the Department of Defense is moving forward is, imagine a tree. So I will break this tree up into three primary parts. You've got the root system, you've got a main trunk, and then you have the canopy. And so when we think about that tree, the roots are pulling in nutrients, they're pulling in resources, and they're feeding it into the tree to nourish it and help it grow. And then you have the trunk that provides the structure, the stability, and the security of that tree for it to be able to withstand any of the environmental challenges that it might run into. And then you've got the canopy. Canopy provides nourishment as well, right? It's able to pull information. But mostly the canopy is a dynamic environment. So when you think about those three parts, the root system of a tree doesn't change very often. The trunk doesn't change very often. The canopy changes all the time. Leaves come and go every year. So how does that apply to us from a technical perspective? Think of the roots as data. How am I gathering data, whether it's from legacy warehouses, from common data layers, from data meshes, you name it. How am I taking all of these different data holdings and then bringing them into an environment? The trunk is knowledge. How am I structuring and managing that knowledge in such a way that I'm able to feed it into the canopy and the rest of the ecosystem so that everybody is able to process that information in a quick and efficient manner? And then the canopy is applications and systems, right? What we're trying to do is get to a standard in data and knowledge so that all of the canopy is able to, one, integrate together. Suddenly now everything can work off of the same piece. What typically happens is I have a leaf, and now I'm going to change my trunk and I'm going to change my roots to match that leaf. And then we get caught into this proprietary structure for how we're handling data, how we're handling knowledge. And unfortunately, sorry to break your hearts, we are never going to have a solution, right? We are always going to have legacy capability that we are going to have to bring and integrate into other legacy capabilities and into new and emerging capabilities. And so interoperability and integration really truly is the coin of the realm for how we are trying to move forward. And so if you don't play well with others, this is going to become more and more of a challenge from a technological perspective because we are going to have less ability to be able to leverage those proprietary capabilities because we are trying to leverage the standardization of knowledge and data so that we're able to integrate quickly. So one of the advantages that this brings for us that becomes really, really important is, I talked about how I'm able to see the environment. So my domain awareness, like what is around me? Well, I also have to be able to understand that environment. And so, it's one thing to be able to see that I've got a Zhengkai or a Luoyang or a commercial freighter vessel here. But how do I understand what it brings to bear from a foundational military perspective? What's its operational readiness, that force disposition? How does it meet the the requirements of what we might expect them to posture in order to execute certain types of missions, or does it? That's how I understand that environment. Well, in order for me to see the environment, for me to understand the environment, I also have to think ahead of how do I continue to have awareness of that environment. So how am I doing my collection orchestration, my management for my sensors to be able to feed that information into my ability to know what's going to happen and know how to be prepared to see what's going to happen in the future. And then finally, and ultimately for what we do, how do I apply effects? And so whether those are kinetic effects or non-kinetic effects, each of these things rely on the other for us to be able to move forward. And so this knowledge management and data management becomes really critical, because that is how we are going to be able to bring these different stovepiped capabilities together so that we're going to be able to meet decision advantage for the commander and hopefully be successful in any type of competition, crisis, or conflict. The last thing that I'll leave you with is, we talk about AI a lot, right? Everybody's interested in what we can do with AI. I don't think we actually deal a lot with AI. We deal a lot with machine learning, right? We're doing a lot with machine learning, whether it's from predominantly computer vision, how are we able to see and process that information, incorporate it, but we don't actually do a lot with AI. One of the challenges that we have from an analytics perspective is how can I leverage AI to affect or enable an analyst? So I don't anticipate that we are going to see in the near term, hey, how do I go to GPT and say, hey, why are they doing this, right? We're not going to have confidence that the AI is going to provide an authoritative response that we are going to be able to use for decision advantage or to be able to execute mission off of. What I can use AI off of right now is extractive AI. I have millions and millions of points of data that we are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. How do I organize that? How do I process it? How do I sort through it in a quick fashion so that when I ask my question, what I'm doing is I'm able to pull those data elements forward to the analyst so the analyst can process it quickly, where I do have confidence in their ability to apply tradecraft according to ICD standards, Intelligence Community Directive standards, and then that is what we provide to the commander. So I would just offer, from an AI perspective, mostly what we're looking for is how can we anticipate and use AI to sort through information, and then when I ask this question, I may anticipate that it's going to bring me a basket of oranges, but it may also bring me a basket of tangerines and a basket of pineapples because they have bearing on what I'm doing, and I wasn't necessarily thinking about that. That's the value that I think the AI piece is going to provide for us.
Okay, so we had hoped to leave about 45 minutes for questions. We've left 44 minutes and 31 seconds, so we're pretty much on track here. And with that, I think we'll take the first question.
Okay, thank you. We do have some questions here from the audience. First question, what geographic combatant commands other than U.S. Indo-PACOM would have the most significant roles in a conflict with the PRC?
That's a great question. And I don't know that there's an easy single answer, because obviously a conflict with the PRC is going to be a global event. And there's going to be effects that will need to be achieved in every corner of the world. And they're not all the same. They're not all necessarily military, but there's going to be a role for all of them. And part of the way we are preparing for that is Indo-Pacific Command has been designated as the global coordinating authority for the campaign, potentially against China. And so we are in routine and recurring contact with our partners in the other commands in order to prepare for that. And so the short answer I would give you is effort is ongoing to figure out how to achieve the right effects in the right places. And our partners in the other GCCs know that they've got a role in this, and we're all working towards that end state. Okay. That was an easy one. Come on, next.
Thank you, sir. This next question is for Ben Needles. some time ago, Mr. Needles posted on his LinkedIn account a 4-part series about his view of
He sure did.
challenges and opportunities. It's a 2-part question. First is, since that time, what has changed in your thoughts on the posted article? What views have changed? And secondly, how do vendors submit proposed solutions to INDOPACOM to address gaps and priorities for your team's screening?
That was an emotional post. So, have things changed? I would say yes, things have changed. You have seen much more of a concerted enterprise approach from the defense intelligence community as combined with the intelligence community to get towards how do we consolidate approaches to bring capability to bear. Check. That was something that absolutely needed to happen. I think one of the other benefits that we have seen is that there's been an acknowledgement that not just the normal processes for how you do acquisition are options, but you've seen, for instance, DepSec DevHicks and rapid capability delivery has tried to get resourcing and accelerated processes in place for us to be able to bring acquisition elements much faster. You've got DIU, you've got InQtel. There's a host of capabilities out there to try and accelerate how we do some of that acquisition. What has not happened yet? So, oftentimes in a lot of the problems that we talk about, what people don't realize is that technology is usually the easiest part of the solution for what it is we're trying to accomplish. The hardest part, oftentimes, has been policy, and how do we implement policy to meet the requirements that we have for the new way ahead, if you will. So, for instance, as we move through different knowledge management methodologies, those knowledge management methodologies are going to require a change in tradecraft. It's going to require a change in governance for how we work through those knowledge management methodologies. Those have not kept pace with what it is that we need to do. Unfortunately, I think sometimes people think that that's just a simple thing. It's like, hey, I'm going to write this paper. It's going to get stamped by some SES 3 or 4 or a 4-star, and we're going to be good, right? Everything's going to work. And I don't think there's an appreciation that we have to iterate policy like we do technology, right? We need to get policy changes in place quickly. We need to test and experiment with what the implications of those policy changes are, identify what worked, what did not work. Is it actually scratching the itch of what we needed? Think of like our ally and partner sharing, for instance, as an example, and then iterate on that policy to make sure that we get it right. Those are the types of things that I don't think we have seen nearly advance the way that we need to in order to meet a lot of the requirements that we have. From a requirements perspective, we do have a vendor screening process that we use at INDOPACOM. It goes through our J8. So that is the entry point into the command for vendors to approach us. What we're doing internally is we're developing a more robust requirements management process to allow us to identify what are J2 and then what are J2 requirements, and then J2 requirements that require iteration and integration with our other JDRs or with our service components. We're capturing those and documenting them. And so that way when we get vendors who propose solutions, we have a better way to be able to screen and look at how those vendors might be able to get the specific things that we're doing. So, but I would tell you that the J8 is your entree point into PACOM for how you kind of get access into the system and process for what we're doing.
Thanks. Okay.
And I'm not posting the link in ever again. Just kidding.
Thank you, sir. The next question. We know that the Chinese are learning from the Ukraine conflict. Do they have a replicator equivalent? And can you talk at all about how they are changing their unmanned vehicle employment and development?
You take first shot at it? And
Sure, I'll take a first shot.
Yeah.
So I think that China is studying the Ukraine conflict extremely closely, and I think that there's probably some elements that are profoundly sobering for them, and I think there are other elements where you have a little bit of motivated reasoning that it tells them that what they are already doing, what they already think is important, and their efforts to integrate unmanned and automated systems into the PLA predate the Ukraine conflict by quite a bit. And I think that it has more re-emphasized the importance rather than fundamentally changed the direction. I think that that does have important implications too, because it means that funding streams continue, means that R&D continues along those sectors, and I can't speak to specifics, but they are making progress, and they are starting to integrate some of those systems into their operational forces. That's first stab at it.
Yeah,
Loren, you want
no,
to
I would completely agree with everything Will said, and just add a couple of things. The Chinese have invested very heavily in unmanned and autonomous systems for a number of years. Yeah. And the lessons that they're likely deriving out of Ukraine is that that's the right direction to go. It's in sea systems, it's in air systems, it's in undersea systems, and there's kind of a broad range of developmental efforts that are at various stages of implementation. It's a dynamic environment where the lessons that were visible a year ago are different than the lessons that are visible today. So it's kind of important that you have a consistent stare at it and that you revisit what you thought you knew periodically, because life as we know it is changing. But it's clear they are absolutely paying very close attention, and I would just foot stomp Will's earlier comment. It hasn't fundamentally changed their direction in terms of developing and fielding a force. It's caused them to double down and emphasize things like speed and efficiency and combined arms in ways that we're seeing played out in training now. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question. Opinions seem to be all over the place on this, but what are your opinions, or can you share your opinions, on the veracity of recent reports that PRC may have broken military-grade encryption using quantum computing?
Run, Forrest, run. I can't comment authoritatively on it. A, because I don't know, and B, because I probably couldn't in this session if I did know. What I can offer is the Chinese have, like UAVs and unmanned systems, they have dedicated a tremendous amount of developmental effort into quantum for a number of years now. And whether or not they've made this breakthrough or not, I honestly can't talk to. But they're certainly giving it the old college try and working very deliberately to try to gain fundamental advantage in that domain. So it's a unsatisfying answer, but it's honestly the best that I think I can do at this point.
Yeah, I'll only add that in addition to dedicating a lot of effort against that, our encryption standards for military-grade encryption are conservative by nature. And so if we get evidence that we think that they have been compromised, then we're gonna adjust them. So
I have no idea.
Thank you. The next question. How do you prioritize intelligence gathering and analysis in a multi-domain environment where cyber, space, and traditional warfare intersect?
I'm pausing to reflect, because it's a great question. But I guess the way I would answer it is the requirements are prioritized not by domain, but by topic or by content. And the solution to the requirements is where it gets into each of those domains, because the capabilities are radically different in each. Some of them lend themselves much more successfully into certain types of information. But that's the whole requirements management process that we go through at a joint level within the command and the components on the U.S. side, and increasingly in a combined environment where we're leveraging our most capable allies and partners in ways that help us to sense and understand this increasingly complex environment within that.
Yeah, I would just add, I've got a collection manager who works for me, and he beats me over the head with this on a semi-regular basis. He says, don't tell me how you want to know something, tell me what you want to know, and I will apply the various tools that I have, including across the joint, up at Indo-PACOM and across the joint force and with the partners and allies, and I will answer that information. It's agnostic, it's capability agnostic. We are, you put the requirement into the collection management process, and then they will farm it out to the folks that can do it, and then it will be, regardless of domain, it will end up getting processed back to you.
You don't know anything about this one either.
No,
Okay.
I'd just be saying the same thing you guys said. I mean, it all depends, right? So sometimes it may be, hey, this is the best way to do it, and maybe that's not available, so you got to figure out another way to do it. So it's
Yeah.
what do you need to know, and then let them figure out how to collect that information.
And the last thing I would just note, we learned a tremendous amount as a nation and as a military during the War on Terror. Many of those lessons don't work here. The geography is different, the technology is different, the access is different, the collection platforms are different. And so we're having to relearn or adapt many of the things that we've become comfortable with in the last 20 plus years, because this is this is a different game in every aspect. So.
Thank you, and understand again that this is an intelligence panel, and this may not be a question you can answer, but can you talk about what you might see as a red line for the PRC to use kinetic options against U.S. territory and or equipment?
That's a policy question. That's not.
Well, it's
Yeah,
a adversary.
It's a threat question, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll take a crack at this. I have played red in a number of unclassified war games, and I will speak to the dynamic there with the caveat that war games are poor substitutes for reality. But the dynamic tends to be a conservative start where everybody's trying to avoid escalation, and then a ping pong of effects where we're achieving an effect using a facility, and so they take that facility. And then, well, oh, you took that facility, so we're going to take the thing that took your facility. And then pretty soon it escalates into full war in many of these types of environments. So as for specific red lines that would cause that, I think that I will offer representative examples, not predictions. I can see there being scenarios in which China might choose to attack U.S. territory in response to U.S. Strikes on Chinese territory or something like that. Or the loss of a major combatant or something that causes them to consider that their plan is not working as intended and that they need to provide up the pressure on the United States.
Talk, if you would, a little bit, Will, about the difference between lethal capabilities and non-lethal capabilities.
Well, non-lethal capabilities are inherently more containable and less escalatory. It's one thing to say you made my battleship stop working. It's another thing to say you sunk my battleship, and that I've not seen identical dynamics in the non-lethal realm.
Yeah, and the way I would characterize it, and the reason I wanted to go there, is the use of non-lethal capabilities probably has a much different threshold for employment than does lethal force, because they are reversible, because they are less lethal by definition, but they can be used as an escalation management tool, but they can also be used as a deterrence tool, deterring or dissuading the U.S. from becoming critically involved in a crisis. Because remember, I think it's a fair statement to say the Chinese have no desire to fight the United States. Mm-hmm. Clearly, they think that's a really bad idea. So they're going to try everything within the kit bag to keep it from generating into exchange of munitions. And certainly the cyber effects, the non-lethal effects, space-based capabilities are all within the arsenal of escalation management, mm-hmm. first and foremost. And if they don't work, they can always be scaled up with additional effects within that. So red lines are a really hard thing to address because they're not written in stone. They move within a situation. They move sometimes within a day because the political and military environment shift rapidly. And so it sounds like we're being traditional weaselly intel guys and say, I can't give you a specific answer. But it's because I don't think there really is a specific answer within that. And a lot of what the Chinese are intending to do early in a conflict is political in nature. It's manifest as military or other military-like activities, but it's about influencing U.S. decision-making and commitment. And then also secondarily, ability to join the fight within that. So hopefully that gives a little sense of a response.
I have one additional thought here, and that is, I think underlying the question is not an assumption, but just a recognition that attack on U.S. territory is more of a part of the conversation than it would have been 10, 15 years ago. It's sort of an uncomfortable conversation, an uncomfortable realization. But like the order of battle dynamics that I described in my prepared remarks, you don't need a sub-launched land attack cruise missile to hit Guam. You do need it to hit targets farther away. So it is at least within the realm of discussion. Chinese military doctrine, the most recent Science of Strategy 2020, has a fascinating discussion of what they call guerrilla warfare at sea, where they're operating outside of the range of and support of land-based fires, presumably forward deployed. And they also have discussions of an increasing naval capability to conduct firepower strikes. Again, not something you need for Taiwan. You can hit Taiwan from mainland China pretty easily. So it is part of the dynamic in a way that I don't think that we have fully acclimated to yet, but that is not necessarily red lines. That is just more a dimension of the potential conflict.
I kind of want to ask you guys a follow-up to that, though.
Yeah, okay.
So what happens when a non-kinetic effect, so let's say you execute a cyber effect on a water treatment facility, and then suddenly U.S. population, and I have 100 deaths from dysentery within my civilian population now. That was intended to be a non-kinetic effect. Mm-hmm. You have killed U.S. civilians. It's one thing to take a military weapon on a military warship and you take military casualties. Now you have civilian casualties executed.
I know exactly the answer to that. I don't know. I mean, it
just shows how
that's right. It's
unhard or how difficult it is to evaluate that.
We can predict the intended effects, and we'll almost certainly be wrong. And the same thing's going to happen for the Chinese. But you also have a little bit more wiggle room on something like that. Okay, prove that we were responsible, and it's not just your old antiquated crappy system that failed and caused the death of your own people. That's one of the beauties of non-lethal effects oftentimes, is because attribution is much more difficult to ascribe or to publicize, even if you do know in other channels within it. So nothing's clean.
Yeah. Get off SCADA.
Yeah. Okay, next.
Thank you. The next question, Mr. Needles spoke of interoperability and integration of multiple legacy systems to deliver greater capabilities and outcomes in the future. How do you see rolling out the current and future technologies that make data-driven decision superiority a real thing for the command? Is there a vision for building out, testing, and delivering real solutions within 799 days?
Yep, that is what we are focused on. So I do not ask for new things, right? When you think about, I'm not going to ask for a new capability for how we do the common operating picture or the common intelligence picture. What I'm going to ask for is how do I take the existing capabilities, and then how do we modernize elements and components of them enough? How do we focus on connective tissue, right now, baling twine and duct tape, to take these different capabilities, connect them together to provide an advantage that was never organically built into the tool. Use that as an iterative process to then inform a larger material solution requirement that, 5-7 years down the road, I have something that's far more advanced that has that integrated interoperability. So to use the analogy, how do I build a rat rod right now and get a Tesla in the future, right? That is what we're focused on, is how do we take these different capabilities and then focus on how we bring them together. That, I think, is very doable, right? And we've had success with that in trying to bring different things together. But that's what we're focused on.
Thank you. The next question. What assumptions do you think the Chinese are making about U.S. capabilities and commitments based on the Ukraine conflict?
I'll take a shot
Ready,
at
go.
this one. Yeah. I think that they are probably sobered by the speed and the scale and the scope of U.S. and allied support to Ukraine. And I think that there is, especially like with the dynamic that Ukraine's not a NATO ally, we did not have a formal security alliance with them. You haven't had a U.S. president state accidentally 4 times that we would support Ukraine. So I think that given the legacy of the partnership with the United States and U.S. stated intent, U.S. longstanding security cooperation and provision of weapons and defensive munitions, defensive capabilities, I think that a prudent planning assumption, actually I know this is a prudent planning assumption because they say it in their doctrine, is that the U.S., they have to plan on the assumption that the U.S. is going to intervene. Ukraine provides a footnote for what that could look like on a low end, and Taiwan, I think they would expect it to be a higher level, at least for planning purposes, right? You can't assume that the strong adversary is not going to intervene fully. If you do that, you're a very foolish PLA planner. So I think that is provides a footnote for their fears.
And I think it's fair to say that we've all learned a ton out of watching Ukraine. U.S. has learned a ton, Ukraine, Russia, and China. I think it's also fair to say that one of the things the Chinese have been most surprised by is the unity of the international response, especially in the political and economic domains. Yeah, we focus on the military stuff because that's what they pay us to do. But it's the additive economic power of a coalition that really, I think, bothers the Chinese most in their planning processes. If they can plan against an adversary, a couple adversaries, it's very different than if you've got 15 or 18 or 50 within it. Just pay attention to how the Chinese message our multilateral activities and our multilateral engagements to get a sense of how concerned they are by it. Because they're really trying to drive a wedge in between us and our partners, us and our emerging relationships, changes in the multilateral space. It's at least clear to me, looking at it, that struck a nerve.
Yeah.
And it's something that they're working very deliberately to try to counter.
Yeah, and if you look at the Taiwan challenge from a Chinese doctrinal perspective, like they want to plan out and own the initiative for all steps, right? Like they do operations research, and I know the doctrine is not always entirely true of how they see it, but the way they talk about it is they think they can go out like with plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, and work out all the branches and sequels for at least a given period of time. When you add the alliance dynamics in there, it becomes completely unmanageable, especially with the number of different countries and systems that could be mobilized in support of Taiwan. So I think it would make them pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah. And the good thing is there's a lot more countries that are engaged in the Indo-Pacific today than there were a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. As the realization of what China's all about and the necessity to counter their ability to change the international order in ways that they're trying to accomplish. So we've got far more weird and wacky visits to the headquarters today than we've ever had, and it's all good. But it's a challenge for us to figure out how to interoperate with some of these non-traditional partners and how to bring them into a unified effort against the potential PRC challenge.
Okay, thank you. And you've just touched on some of this in your previous answer, but is there anything more that you can add about how the U.S.-Taiwan relationship is evolving as a result of recent PLA provocations, such as Exercise Joint Sword?
I'll start with that one and
Yeah,
then
please.
let you guys chime in. I would say, and this is going to, some of you are going to be skeptical about this response. Our relationship with Taiwan has not fundamentally changed. It hasn't in a long time. The approach to the U.S. about maintaining the status quo and not allowing a forcible change by either side is sometimes misperceived because there's been so much dramatic change on the PRC side. When we assist Taiwan with their defensive capabilities, we're in fact maintaining the status quo. If one side's growing and the other side's not, it's no longer status quo. So you have to kind of keep things in balance in order for it to be maintained. We have not fundamentally changed any policy towards Taiwan. We've re-articulated some things. We've perhaps clarified some things. But the state of the relationship is actually pretty consistent. Now, if you ask that same question in Beijing, you will get a completely different response.
Yeah.
Because they see it very differently.
Yeah, that's actually the angle I was going to take. So, yeah, it's long continuity in U.S. posture towards Taiwan. I think that China has a predisposition to interpret symbolically, like political symbolism as quite meaningful. And so if you see someone with a high protocol order in the U.S. government visiting Taiwan, they take that to be more politically significant than we intend it to be. And like the underlying policy has not changed. But from China's perspective, I think that they would be deeply concerned about the direction of U.S.-Taiwan partnership, even though the substance hasn't changed. And then we're not talking about this too much, but like more concerned about the direction of Taiwan domestic political opinion, which is outside of my wheelhouse, but I know is not going China's way.
In the U.S. intelligence community, we talk a lot about the danger of mirror imaging.
Yeah.
But sometimes the Chinese mirror image us. And the example of our relationship with Taiwan is a good example of that. They don't recognize the separation of the powers within the U.S. governmental system in the same way. So if a member of Congress chooses to travel, they have full authority to do so. And the president doesn't really have the right to say yay or nay. From the Chinese point of view, yes, he does.
Yeah.
Because in their system, there is that veto power. And it's frustrating for them to look at us operating differently and for them to accept the reality of that.
Thank you. I have one more question here in the back, and then I can turn it back to you for any additional discussion before we close. But are you able to talk at all about the roles various OSINT disciplines play in J2 analysis?
Yeah, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'll take that. So, the way we're looking at open source information, I mean, it is another source of information, right? It is how people are presenting out intentionally or unintentionally to the community. And so, a lot of the open source data has been exploited by industry for the longest time, right? To be able to get at how they understand what consumers are doing, understanding what's trending, what people like, what people don't like, where are you going, what are you interested in, so on and so forth. We have been late to that game. And so, getting that, using open source information that's available to try and get a better insight into how people are looking at news, for instance. What are they consuming? Does that give us insights into, hey, how is people absorbing information? What are the right mediums for how they're absorbing information? How are people using technology to try and process data and incorporate it into their decision making? And then how does that translate into what other leaders are doing? So for us, it wouldn't be a government thing if we didn't focus on how are we getting the right policies in place, how are we looking at making sure that we've got the right safeguards in place. Something for us, obviously, from a U.S. perspective, is, we're very concerned about, citizen security, privacy of information, and so how are we gathering information? How are we using it properly? How are we making sure that we're not collecting on our own people? So looking at how we have the right safeguards in place so that we're able to take advantage of what's being put out there freely by, whether it's a state entity, a pseudo-state entity, or just the general populace, and then using that to give us indications. A lot of people, hey, there's a fire over here at this airfield. Looks like a military jet. Take a picture, post it on Sina Weibo or Twitter or what have you. Sometimes those become some of the first indicators that we get that, hey, there's some type of crisis. Something's happened with a platform, or there's something going on, I'm trying to think HADAR events and stuff like it. It gives us insights that we can take advantage of and then be able to act more and be more responsive to.
I'm an analyst by profession, my career field. And it drives me absolutely crazy to hear my colleagues every once in a while go, oh, I don't have any intelligence on this. I only have OSINT. Wait a minute. Please, what does OSINT stand for? What's the int in OSINT stand for? OSINT is no better, no worse than any other intelligence discipline. They all have advantages and disadvantages. They all need corroboration. They all need validation. It is one of many toolkits in an analytic kit bag that provide us more. The amount of information that's available in open source today is magnitude light years ahead of where we used to be. And our ability to know more is challenged because we have so much more to have to sift through. But if we're really true to our profession and our tradecraft, we treat it exactly like any other discipline and use it and misuse it and abuse it as appropriate, just like we do SIGINT and HUMINT and everything else. We all have inherent biases towards things that we like. In general, almost everybody likes imagery intelligence because you can look at a picture and understand what it is. Almost everybody hates SIGINT or HUMINT for various other reasons. And in general speaking, a lot of Intel professionals don't trust OSINT. And it's an unfounded mistrust, I think, in a lot of cases. We're getting better at it, but we still got a ways to go.
Yeah, my only addition to these comments is I find it useful. There's a sort of a subcategory of open source intelligence, or it's just open source information that does the aggregation and translation for you. So I'll plug for the China Aerospace Studies Institute, the China Maritime Studies Institute. They put out authoritative translations, actually machine translations of authoritative PRC documents. And you guys heard me quote from Science of Strategy way too much in my talk today. That's something that China uses to train their senior colonels. They're preparing for leading the PLA on how to think about strategy. Profoundly useful in understanding intent and interpreting what they're going to do. And it also has a great leading indicator. They've been saying that they want to move towards a nuclear-powered submarine force for more than a decade in that type of writing. And we're seeing them finally start to get towards it. So when I'm training my new analysts, I point them in that direction. Same thing with academia. If Taiming Chung says something about China's defense industry, he knows more about it than most people in the IC. So there's such longevity and expertise within the academic community that I'm going to have China's respect for intellectual property and plagiarize all of it and pass it on to the boss. It's great.
Hey, I will add one piece, and that is there's a difference between publicly available information and open source intelligence, right? So there's a doctrinal difference for us. I think that becomes important to this question, and I was remiss in mentioning it earlier. Everybody's got access to publicly available information, right? It's out there. It's either somebody puts it out there or you can buy it and have access to it. For us, from a doctrinal perspective, and is when you apply tradecraft to this publicly available information, right? So when a trained intelligence professional working against a requirement is processing that information and using tradecraft, it is now open source intelligence. Until that happens, it's publicly available information. It may be a little squirrely to some folks in how they think about it, but for us, it's a very clear line, and it becomes important because that's how we are able to doctrinally apply tradecraft and define information as being, hey, this was publicly available versus this is actual open source intelligence that's been processed according to IC standards.
So we appreciate your attendance here today. Great questions. Hopefully this has been somewhat useful. And I'm going to ask Will if you wouldn't mind closing us. Would you share that quote that you told me earlier?
Oh, yeah.
I think that's a great way for us to finish.
So there's a great scholar. His name is Andrew Erickson. He works at the China Maritime Studies Institute, old friend. And he came out here a couple of weeks ago, and I mentioned to him that just things are changing so fast. And I shared a couple Chinese idioms. There's one is 学无止境. It means knowledge is an endless quest. And he's like, oh, I've got one that's better than that. It's by Cui Jian, the father of Chinese rock. And it is 不是我不明白，而是世界变得太快. It's not that I don't understand, it's that everything is the world changes too fast. And that is 100% my experience in looking at the PLA. You blink, and they've got a whole new weapon system. You blink, and the reforms that are, they're going to take a really long time. It's like 9 years. It changes so fast, and it's a fascinating and humbling thing to work on.
Sure.
All right.
Good to see
Thank you. Let's give these gentlemen a round of applause. So, Loren, Ben, Will, on behalf of AFCEA International, AFCEA Hawaii, thanks for being here today. Thanks for your alarming insights to start it off with, but I definitely appreciated the rest of the comments and the line of questioning about overcoming some of the challenges, continuing to keep advantages in areas where we need to, and then continuing to innovate and press forward in areas that we may find ourselves at disadvantage at this point. With 700 and how many days? 798 now? 798 now, right? Because one day's gone. But I will tell you that I am optimistic. In this digital and cyberspace, and there's probably a lot of industry partners out here that want to jump in and help make a difference. But our country has been in this position before. But it is the power of these three key elements of our society. It's our government, all right? It's our lead, it's our military, but it's our industry and our academia that are going to get us in the position that we need to be to confront these challenges in this theater. So there are the right people in this room to help make a difference and get after that 790-day clock. So I also want to say that on behalf of AFCEA International and AFCEA Hawaii, we are going to provide a donation to the Friends of the Windward Wounded Warriors on your behalf.
Outstanding.
And in just a second, I'm going to give you some coins, because we have the highly coveted and sought after TechNet Indo-Pacific Challenge coin, celebrating the 39th TechNet Indo-Pacific. And I'll give you those in just a second.